Number of attendees is still growing, but I think in a few seconds we'll begin. We'll kick off in the interest of time. All right, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to what is now the fourth session of the monthly webinar series, ETS for Policy Practitioners, which is hosted by the International Carbon Action Partnership with support from the European Commission. My name is Michael Mehling. I work at the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, and I'm excited to moderate today's session, the topic of which is carbon pricing for land use, agriculture, and forestry. Now, as many of you know, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, often called AFOLU for short, are responsible for about a quarter of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions around the globe. That's about 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 equivalent every single year, almost twice as much as the annual emissions of the United States. And these emissions mainly come from deforestation, agriculture, livestock, soil management, etc. So that, of course, offers an enormous potential to reduce global emissions, but the mitigation potential of the sector is not limited to reducing emissions, say through improved agricultural practices or by avoiding deforestation. It can also reduce emissions through removals of greenhouse gases, and that's something that will be increasingly important as we move forward on the path to deep decarbonization. Applying policies, including carbon pricing, to leverage this potential faces a number of challenges, however. There's problems with data availability, the sheer number of emission sources and actors that are involved and can influence emissions, ensuring the permanence of emissions reductions, enforcing policies effectively in rural or often remote areas, and so on and so forth. So today we want to really explore the options for bringing agriculture, land use, and forestry into a carbon pricing regime and the lessons that have been learned with existing experiences. We've got about 90 minutes to discuss the topic, starting with an introductory presentation and reactions from a truly stellar panel of experts, and I'll be introducing them in a few moments. After those remarks, we'll open up for discussion with the audience. And at that point, I'd ask you to please use the Q&A function in Zoom. You should see a link at the bottom of your screen, an icon where you can hit Q&A and then enter your question. And when you do so, please briefly mention who you are, introduce yourself, and also who you're directing the question to. I also want to make sure that everybody knows the session is being recorded and it will be made available online. Towards the end of the session, we'll post the link where you can find the recording once it's been processed, and also announcements for future webinar sessions in this webinar series, as well as materials such as the presentations. But before we launch into the presentations, I'd like to ask co-host Renato Roldao to guide us through a quick poll. We'd like to gauge the audience's views on a handful of questions related to using carbon pricing to address land use activities. And we'll actually be revisiting one of those questions in the same interactive format after the presentations to see whether anybody's views, whether any of your views have changed on that question. So please, Renato, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Just checking if you can hear me well.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. We have a truly global audience attending this webinar today. So what we are going to do, I'm going to play here three questions to start with before we move on into the presentations. And there is a link that you can double click on the chat box. And so you will be able to respond live to these questions. So I'm going to start with the first one. So please get ready, and we will give you some seconds so that you can respond. So the first question is now live.
Again, if anybody doesn't have it, you click on chat to open the chat box and you'll have the link there.
So now we crossed the threshold, or approximately 50% response rate based on our current live audience. I just give few more seconds for other people to keep answering. And as we get close to 100, or if the number stabilize, then we'll stop this one and we'll get to the next one. Just interesting to see here, because it's important to take a picture of the, or feel the pulse of the audience just before we carry on with the presentations, and whether or not the knowledge that we'll be sharing during the session might influence the way we look at different aspects related with this topic. So we pretty much now stabilizing a little bit the answers, close to 80 out of 100 plus participants, where there is a clear majority of respondents that they say yes, they think that there are robust ways to include in agriculture, forestry, and land use activities in a carbon pricing system. So we have now on screen 78 yes, 22 no, and as we cross 80 plus respondents, I will then stop this one and move into the next one. Just hold on there. So the next one goes. Please use your devices then to address the second question, and we'll follow the same dynamics as we did for the first one. Of course, there's more choices, so there's a little bit more time needed for you to read through it and respond. So we'll give you the time.
Brings me back to the election night in November.
Okay, so we cross more than 50% of the response rate here.
Looks like we have a favorite here too, pretty clearly. But it's a bit more evenly distributed.
Yeah, so now we're getting to a similar response rate to the previous one. Let's see if the numbers stabilize. And with 77 responses in out of 100 plus, we have 40% saying that what is the most sensible way to include agriculture, forestry, land use activities in a carbon pricing system is through the voluntary carbon market, followed by as a source of offset credits for compliance with international climate obligations, and in the third place, relatively close as a source of offset credits for compliance with domestic climate obligations, and in the fourth place as a covered activity in a compliance ETS. Okay, great. So now I will stop. We have 81 responses. Let's move on to the final question of this segment, and then we'll carry on with the presentation. So the third question is now on. So more than 50% response rate in as well. There is seems to be a clear winner also on this one.
Great.
So the main challenge emerging here, according to the audience, is a reliable MRV system, followed by the three others that I think there's quite a distance between the first one and the others in terms of the permanence of emissions, followed by accounting for biodiversity and the sharing benefits with the local communities. So we have also 82, 83 responses. I will stop now and I will give the floor back to Michael. And then towards the end, we will have one last question that will be playing using this system. Thank you very much. And I wish you continuation of good session.
Great, thank you, Renato. I think this sets us up very, very nicely because we've looked at some of the options, also at some of the challenges. And I have no doubt that in the presentations that will follow now, we'll be going into more depth on all of these. As I mentioned before, without exaggeration, it's a stellar panel. I couldn't wish for a better panel to look at these issues. I'll introduce them each in sequence of how they'll present. So we'll start with Susie Kerr, who is Chief Economist with the Environmental Defense Fund, currently in New York. Many of you, of course, know her as a proud New Zealander who's worked in the public sector in New Zealand with the government, but also in research and academia. And she, of course, has a unique vantage point to carbon pricing in New Zealand, which is one of the few systems that has integrated forestry in a compliance emissions trading system. We'll then have a response after this initial presentation with a presentation of her own by Charlotte Streck, who's currently in Berlin. She's director of Climate Focus and co-founder of Climate Focus, but also long and illustrious history working on these issues. I think her heart, like mine, is partly in forests in Latin America. So we've both spent a lot of time in South America and Central America. And so she'll share some insights from her experience working on these topics. And finally, last but not least, by no means, Susana Vélez Aller, who is regional manager for Latin America and the Caribbean at Verra. So the organization that issues or manages the VCS standard, among others. But she too she's in Colombia, and she too has deep experience working in public and private sector on these issues. And she's a forest engineer. So again, as I said, everybody here immensely qualified to speak to the issues. With that, Susie, I'll let you kick off with the introductory presentation. I think we'd said roughly 15 to 20 minutes. We have a bit of flexibility, and then we'll have the reactions and responses from Charlotte and Susanna after that. Please, Susie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for the invitation to present here. I'll just get my screen up. So, thank you again for welcoming me to be here. Kia ora tātou, ko mangawhau, taku maunga, ko otaki, taku awa, ko Susie Kerr au. In New Zealand, where I come from, it is traditional to give an introduction in Māori, our Indigenous language, and say a little bit about where you're from. Today, I want to speak about a number of issues. There's an enormous amount we could say, so I will focus just on a few. So I want to talk first about who acts and who needs to pay in these systems if you do include pricing. I want to touch on measurement, additionality, permanence, and leakage, which are issues that come up in all systems. And then I want to look specifically at pricing of forests, sequestration, storage in forests, and then pricing of biogenic emissions from agriculture or carbon storage in soils. So who acts and who pays? We know that the landowners and farmers need to act. They are the ones who actually do the mitigation, and ultimately that's what this is all about. So they need to act, communities need to act to support these changes, companies need to act to support these changes, and many others as well throughout the system. So we're trying to get a system shift in agriculture and forestry. Who pays is not necessarily the same as who acts, and that depends on the way the system is designed. So You can set up pricing systems so that the opportunity cost and the economic incentive to mitigate, so the incentives on the farmers, are the same, almost, subtle differences, whether or not the farmer is paid or pays for their emissions. So you have options there. It makes an enormous difference to the distribution of the benefits and the costs. So this is a critical issue, and it's really important to think about who you actually want to pay or how you want to share those benefits and costs across the community. And it's also critical to remember that just because somebody is the person who pays or who receives the credit doesn't mean that they are the one who is most affected ultimately by the economic burden. For example, a farmer may be able to pass costs on to their customers or to others in the supply chain. So that's worth bearing in mind, and that will vary across jurisdictions and situations and contexts. So the policy design, the pricing policy design, determines who is going to actually pay. So I'll just give some examples. First, looking at examples where the farmers or the landowners are actually paying for their emissions or lack of storage. And the government would then receive the revenue. So this could be where there's an actual liability in an emissions trading system. So they're included just like a fossil fuel sector, or they have to pay a tax or a levy. And this could be applied to livestock methane, which is something that is being proposed in New Zealand and has been in the law there for a long time, but not activated. It could be for nitrous oxide from agriculture, and it could be for deforestation. On the other side, you have systems where the farmers or the landowners or the communities are paid and they benefit, they get rewards for their mitigation activities. And in that case, somebody else is paying. So it's the government or taxpayers, it may be the buyers of credits, or it could be a funder if it's done through an aid program. So for example, this could be credits for individual projects or credits for jurisdictional programs, for example, for forests or for agricultural soils. So the four key challenging issues in this space: measurement, additionality, permanence, leakage. Critical one, and I'm interested that this is the major concern of everybody, is measurement. So measurement doesn't need to be perfect. People get quite tied up on this and the idea that you have to know exactly how many tons of carbon there is. We need to remember that at the moment we're pricing at zero. So we're assuming zero. We know that that is wrong. So although we're looking at a second best solution here, zero is not the best solution. And so even if we can get a reasonably accurate measure of how much carbon there is and reward that, we're going to be providing more efficient incentives. To give another example, many of you are familiar with systems to manage fisheries. When you're managing a fishery, what you're ultimately concerned about is the stock of the fish, because you're worried about the sustainability of those stocks. But what we actually regulate is the flow of the fish, which is actually a very poor proxy for the stock. But we're very comfortable with that. So we need to get a similar level of comfort for dealing with forestry and agriculture. What's important is that our measures are unbiased and they can't be manipulated by actors within the system. So those are the important things. And then the more precise we can get those measures, the better. But we don't want to impose large transaction costs. If we have large transactions costs, people will have to worry about the paperwork. They'll be spending all their effort on measurement, and they won't be focusing on the actual mitigation. And mitigation is what matters. Large transactions costs also tend to exclude the smaller or more unsophisticated players, so they create equity issues. Additionality and leakage are also major challenges, and these are harder potentially to resolve. So because in land use, you have a large number of very heterogeneous actors, both the land is heterogeneous and also the farmers are heterogeneous. They're people with personalities. So except in the case of a few very specific, clearly unprofitable technologies, we really can't know what a specific farmer was going to do, whether they would have taken an action even without the reward. And so my recommendation is don't waste your time trying to know, because you're not going to get it right and you're going to put a lot of effort into it. Similarly, accurately identifying the impact of action on one farm or one location on another is important. This is the problem of leakage. You might be reducing emissions in one place, but increasing them somewhere else. But again, you're talking about an economic system. Agricultural products and forestry products are traded internationally. They're part of complex social systems, even at a local level. We're never going to accurately identify what the leakage flows are. So we can potentially try, but maybe more usefully, we can try to make sure that we meet the economic needs that are being displaced by the mitigation in other ways. And that means that there is less pressure for leakage. So if a project is displacing jobs, we can try to find jobs in a different area. If it's displacing food production, we can try to intensify food production somewhere else so there's less need for leakage. Permanence is a particular challenge with anything to do with the storage of carbon, because you could increase or protect the store, but it can be released again. In some countries, you could enforce permanence of these sorts of credits for long periods, but you can't do that in others. It's just not possible in terms of legal and administrative structures. And nowhere can you actually require permanence forever. And forever is just a very long time. But this is not a problem unique to agricultural storage, to soils or to forests. We also can't guarantee that we keep coal in coal mines forever. At some point, if it became profitable, people could actually reopen those coal mines and burn that coal. So the ultimate solution to this problem is to shift the system so that we don't want to revert to those activities. There are other things we can do along the way, but that's the ultimate solution. The other thing that can help with a lot of these, in fact, all of these issues, is scale and also having a long-term emissions vision. So embedding your activities within a plan that for the country as a whole is going to move down to low emissions reduces the chance that you're making gains in one period, but they just get reversed in a later period because the whole country is shifting in a particular direction. A jurisdictional program where results are measured over a large area can make a big difference. It means that measurement is more likely to be unbiased because you're averaging over large areas. It reduces additionality problems because it removes a lot of the self-selection issues. And it can even affect permanence because if you're going to make changes over a large area, you're more likely to be meeting those economic needs in other ways. So moving on to some actual examples. The reason, you might wonder why I've got a cow on a picture of deforestation, and that's because in New Zealand, which is my first example, the main driver of deforestation was demand for land for cows for dairy production. So what New Zealand decided to do was to put a full liability on anyone who cleared forest or cleared, this is particularly plantation forests, so natives aren't under threat, cleared plantation forests and converted them to another use. They would have to pay the cost of all the carbon that had previously been stored in that forest. There was some concerns about this because it affects a fairly small group of people quite severely because only a small group of people were clearing land. So there was a political deal done with some free allocation. So what did this actually do? Well, the first story is actually a cautionary tale. Because people could see this coming, they knew that if they cleared their forest land before 2008, they could do so without liability. So what you see is from a history of having very low deforestation levels, New Zealand had a burst of deforestation, partly driven by high dairy prices, but partly driven by anticipation of the emissions trading system. So you get this big burst of deforestation, chainsaws running wild until the 1st of January 2008, when it all stops. But there's also a more positive story. So looking after the system started, we see very clear evidence of price responsiveness. So in the grey, what you're seeing is the carbon price in the New Zealand system, which starts out high in the first years of the system. And then along with the CER price in the EU ETS, the price fell down to almost zero. In those first years, in red, you see the amount of deforestation that happened and that was permanent conversions into dairy. And it was extremely low, having been very high before. But when the carbon price fell down to zero, you see the level of deforestation rebounding again. But the more positive story is that that's the period where the prices collapsed to zero, but then the prices actually have risen. And now they're rising very rapidly indeed, as they are in many other systems. So what happened when the prices rose again? Did the deforestation fall again? What you see is yes. This is now in purple because I had to take it from a different data source. So this is showing that when the prices rebounded, the deforestation went back down to zero. So this has been a very effective way of controlling deforestation. Dairy is still doing very well in New Zealand, but the deforestation has essentially stopped. What about reforestation? So again, New Zealand is the only country that has really included it as an integral part of an emissions trading system. So the way it works is that a credit is a tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered. Participation for reforestation is voluntary, so you don't need to participate, but once you're in, you have to stay in or you have to pay back all the credits that you received. A key aspect of the New Zealand system is that the baseline against which you're credited is no planting. So there's no attempt to predict who would have planted forest otherwise, because we're simply unable to know. There are an enormous number of areas where you could plant trees. Some of them are being planted, but we couldn't predict which ones. That makes the system really simple. And what we were trying to do throughout the design was make the system as simple as we could make it. So the way it works in terms of crediting, as we know, trees store the carbon as they grow, but they lose it when they're harvested or if they burned. In New Zealand, burning is not a big issue because it rains all the time, but in other areas it is. So this picture is showing two types of forest. The yellow line is a forest that is left as a permanent carbon store. And this is Pinus radiata, which is the main plantation crop in New Zealand. And the brown line is showing what the carbon stock does in a forest that is rotationally harvested. So it's harvested every 28 years. So it rises, it falls, it rises, it falls. And there are two ways of managing that loss of carbon and that shifting up and down of carbon. So one approach is to only provide credits up to the average stock of a long-term rotational forest. So instead of following that track up and down, we call it a sawtooth, you provide credits up to that blue line, and then you stay at that blue line. So you don't get more credits when the trees keep growing, but nor do you lose credits when they get harvested. And averaged over a large number of forest blocks, this means that you're giving the right number of credits. The other approach is to actually provide the credits all the way through, but have the liabilities. But many foresters were finding that quite hard to manage, and it makes the system much more complex. So there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. So what does this reforestation system actually do? Well, in the early years, it was quite hard to tell. So the first thing to look at on this picture is across on the left, the grey line is the timber price that was being faced in New Zealand. The blue line is the amount of new forest that has been planted. So this isn't replanting, this is additional forest on bare land. So you can tell, looking at the left of the graph, that there's a strong relationship between the timber price and the amount of new planting from this burst of planting in the mid-1990s. Moving forward to the ETS period after 2008, the timber price had fallen to an area where a level where replanting was close to zero. The timber price then stayed more or less in the same range, but with the ETS, you did seem to see some uptick in the amount of new forest planted, but then it falls back down when, as we know, the carbon prices fell back down to zero. Looking over a longer period of time, just extending out that picture, and I'm sorry, again, I had to overlay the data, but in the more recent period after 2014, when the carbon price has picked up again and is now going to quite high levels, well, reasonably high levels, not nearly high enough, I should say, the level of reforestation is also picking up again. And it will be interesting to see what happens in 2020, because you expect a delay between when the carbon price rises and when people respond to it and when they actually manage to get the trees into the ground. So there are indications of some success, not nearly as much success as we had hoped with the initial modelling, and a lot of that is to do with investment uncertainty and uncertainty about the long-term effects of the system. So how would this apply in a developing country? And New Zealand is a very unusual country, and it's very easy to do things there in ways that can't be done in most other countries. So for Latin America, we've been working in Colombia for a long time, and here are some thoughts on the sorts of things you might be able to do in a Latin American context. So the first is, how do you deal with deforestation? In some instances, if this is politically possible, you could hold large development companies who are clearing large areas of land for development of agriculture or other uses. You could hold them liable for the full carbon costs because they are large legal entities. They can be identified and potentially held liable. That would be a possibility. Whether it's politically possible is another question. The other thing that you can do is a jurisdictional program, which would be based on results. For example, that could be done at the level of a department within a country. So the way a jurisdictional program works is that you have a forecast of business as usual carbon stored in the forest. You might set a crediting baseline that's a little conservative. So you expect the country or the jurisdiction to lower deforestation a little through their own efforts, because a business as usual forecast is always very uncertain. And then a group of local actors, which could include government, it could include a farming association, it could include project developers, it could include companies who are active in the area. All of these actors are able to influence the processes that drive deforestation. They work together, they may be able to implement activities such as building enforcement capability, strengthening supply chains, creating individual projects. You could have programs like the Bolsa Verde program in Brazil. If they're effective, then the monitored emissions, or sorry, I should say monitored storage, will be higher than the crediting baseline, and credits are generated for the jurisdiction and then shared according to a benefit sharing approach that has been agreed. What about for reforestation in a developing country? So one possibility, and this is just an idea, but that we think could work, trying to think of the most simple approach that would be possible. One approach is to have rental payments to the owners or the people who have effective control over parcels, because in Latin America, there's a lot of areas where land rights are not very clear. So you don't want to limit to those where there are legal titles necessarily. And why rental payments? This avoids the problem of permanence. So you would simply pay people to keep the carbon on their land for one more year, instead of providing them with a payment that reflects the total amount of carbon that is stored on their land. So here's a simple way it could work. You have a map of the land that is eligible for the program. That's relatively easily done now with satellite imagery. So it could just be that there is no forest on that land in a particular year, and there aren't ecological reasons why you don't want to have outplanting on the land. The owner would have to prove that they have legitimate claim on that piece of land, and they would register with the program and provide bank account details. The forest is sensed remotely, combined with ground truthing to make a better quality product. And then if forest is observed on a person's land, they get paid a rental payment into the bank account automatically based on the inferred forest age and the carbon stock. If the forest is not observed, there's no payment. When the forest is observed and there's a payment, they would receive maybe a text that says, thank you so much for keeping your forest on the land. We've made you a payment. If you keep your forest for another year, then your payment will be larger next year because you'll have more carbon stored, and therefore the rental payment will be higher. It has low transactions costs. There are no permanence issues because you stop paying if the forest is not there. You're not assuming permanence. So that might be the sort of system that could work even in an area where there are no compliance issues, where you can only use satellite imagery, and it's potentially difficult even to establish long-term ownership of land. But incentives are not enough for getting reforestation. This is something we've very much learned in New Zealand, particularly for smaller farmers, even in New Zealand. The large forestry companies can cope by themselves, but smaller landowners can't. So there's need for training in forestry, establishing nurseries, research into appropriate species and varieties to use. You might need programs to directly plant the trees, etc. So there's a series of activities that will complement the incentives that could argue for also having a jurisdictional element to a reforestation program that is based on results. Similarly to what we propose in the deforestation, which is being done a lot through World Bank programs, for example, now. So similarly, you would have a crediting baseline, but now for the jurisdiction for reforestation, you would monitor and model the sequestration that would be involved, and you provide some of the credits at a jurisdictional level to reward the jurisdictional actors for providing this additional support that helps reforestation. So key messages for forests. It is possible to include forestry in an ETS. New Zealand has done it for a number of years. The co-benefits can be very large for biodiversity, flood control, stabilisation of land, jobs. There's a whole series of possibilities which will differ by location. You don't have to assess the additionality for domestic crediting systems. If you give out too many credits, it's just like giving free allocation in any other sector. You don't need to require permanence. There are ways of either holding liability or using rentals. It is important to try and get stability in the system because you're talking about long-term investments, and people won't respond with long-term investments if they think the prices are too uncertain. And simplicity is really important, particularly if you want smaller, less sophisticated players to be involved. So I'll just speak very briefly about agricultural emissions, which is much more an experimental area. It's a much newer area. There are a number of options for including methane or nitrous oxide from agriculture into pricing systems. So I'm just going to throw out some of the options that are being considered. So the first, which is sort of the ultimate solution, is to have farm scale modelling of emissions and have a levy on those emissions. Only a country like New Zealand would be able to do this because it requires really a lot of detailed data and trust. You can do credits for some practices. It's problematic because of the usual problems of being able to identify what farmers would have done otherwise, but sometimes it's the only option, and it can be useful for some clearly unprofitable activities like biodigesters. You could use jurisdictional systems if you can find ways to model emissions at that scale that can't be manipulated by the actors. It's not as easy as with satellite imagery for forests. You can put a levy on nitrogen fertilizer. There are very few providers of nitrogen fertilizer, and that's actually a good proxy for nitrous oxide emissions. You can put a levy on the processor at milk and meat processors, where there's a relatively small number of large actors in most systems, and you make that levy proportionate to the average emissions of the area that is providing products to that milk or meat processor. That is a system that has been in New Zealand law since 2008, but hasn't been activated. In the future, we could provide subsidies for methane inhibitors when they become available and acceptable. So key issues here are that farmers do need to act, and we have to get that message to them, but they don't necessarily need to pay. And I think it's critical to separate those two messages. because otherwise they are extremely resistant, and it's going to be hard enough to get them to change behavior anyway. And consumers need to act too. This is not just about improving practices, it's also about changing diets and changing the sort of products we're purchasing. But we need to be careful to protect the vulnerable against increases in cost of staple foods that they are purchasing. So just sort of key high-level messages, keep your eye on the ball. It's really easy to get hung up on the technicalities and the details of this stuff. But what we're trying to do is mitigate climate change in the short and the long term. So we need to be focused on getting those long-term reductions, on meeting human needs in other ways, in low emissions ways, and making sure that all the people thrive so the systems will be sustainable and equitable. Keep it simple. This is an area where it's so tempting to make life incredibly complex. If it's complex, then you won't get responses, you might get manipulation, and you won't have people focusing on mitigation. And finally, complex tool problems require multiple tools. Pricing is not a full solution. It should be part of a package, and it's not competing with a lot of the other solutions that are being proposed as well. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Susie. Truly, I mean, this was such a wonderful overview of options, but also some really encouraging, I think, experiences from where it's been tested and where it's been used, plus some prospective opportunities to deploy that sound really fascinating. We'll continue in alphabetical order. Before I hand over to you, Charlotte, just quickly, I noticed that there's been a lively chat exchange. And that's good, and I am monitoring that. So if people have trouble using the Q&A function, there's another button that should be at the bottom of your Zoom window where you can access the Q&A. That's fine. I'll try to pick up things from the chat as well. Anybody who has questions to Susie, please put those questions in the Q&A or the chat as a fallback, and we will get back to those. But I'd like to give our discussants the opportunity to respond and also add some of their own insights. Now, Charlotte, over to you, and I think you'll also be sharing your screen. Thanks for joining us.
Very good. Do you see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Yes. Excellent. Okay, so first of all, thank you, Susie, an excellent presentation. And I just want to stress that this New Zealand example, including now the many years of the example and the data and experience, gathered in this period, are extremely relevant as more emission trading systems consider now including forestry. In particularly, it has been now floated also an option for the EU emission trading system, which is the largest operating one. And the EU Commission has traditionally been very reluctant to consider forestry as part of climate mitigation, and in particular the EU ETS. But considering the need to now be much more ambitious in terms of climate policies as we move towards net zero future, but also considering the state of European forest and the need to channel additional finance into the forest operation in the EU, it is a very, very important experience. Similarly, I also want to say that this whole question on how we create incentives to reduce agricultural emissions is also increasingly become a very top agenda point, in markets, in voluntary carbon markets, but also in compliance markets. So thank you. I wanted to spend, a few more minutes on giving additional color and examples to Susie's middle part, looking at voluntary carbon markets and the considerations for demand and supply in carbon markets, not so much from the economic point of view, but essentially from the motivation from the demand and suppliers, but also looking how it fits into their climate strategies. So we have two main sources of demand for carbon offsets from the land sector. One is an increasing number of voluntary corporates that have ambitious or less ambitious, but ambitious climate agreements, which an ambitious climate agreement is described one which has, is based on a science-based target, looks towards net zero, and it is backed by a climate strategy that is based on a combination of reductions of emissions within the company's core operations, and scope 2 and scope 3 emissions, so energy emissions, but also across the supply chain. In this, in the short term, offsetting also has a role to play. And then, of course, we also have always residual emissions that can and should be compensated. Now, we have seen that these corporate commitments have doubled over the last year alone. So there's a lot of buzz and a lot of confusion in this market, but we have now to 1,500, more or less 1,600 companies that have that net zero commitments. These are large players. They together have about 12 trillion in revenues and are responsible for 3.5 gigatons in annual emissions. So we talk about, big players, and the numbers are increasing. So, and Susanna will also say a bit more about the voluntary carbon market. But if we put this into the context of science-based targets, these corporates have to reduce the emissions, as we see, in line with the Paris Agreement. They should at some point go, of course, to net zero, which means that in the transitionary period toward this, offsetting can play a role in combination with mitigation measures. And this is also where emission reductions can play a role. When we look at the eventual offsetting of net emissions, this is something that should ideally be done with carbon removals. And here, keep in mind what Susie said, we have at the moment not enough investment in forests. It's really, really hard to make the economics work for forest restoration. And we need to really think as a community much more on how to make this work. Now, if we look, the second source of offsets are compliance systems. Here I have listed a number of examples. You may, in addition to the New Zealand example or the California example, which are more known here, here I have tried to be a bit colorful in terms of the instrument choice, because you do, and I saw there was one question on this already. You see a link often to AFOLU, so agriculture, forestry, and land use offsets, also to carbon tax systems. Colombia is an example there, where regulated entities can meet part of their commitments with offsets and domestic offsets that are certified under a number of standards. You also see that quite a few of these systems still make reference to the CDM, and this is expected to change as the CDM is phased out, but often the CDM was still the point of reference for the offset supplies in the system. And that also meant that it was very limited what in terms of AFOLU credits could be supplied, because under the CDM, you may remember, only afforestation and reforestation under very narrow circumstances were eligible. Now, if we look at the supply consideration, so in the context of governments establishing emission trading systems, it is, of course, the main driver is to channel funds into domestic forests to meet climate, biodiversity, soil, other environmental and social targets. And Similarly, we look at now in the international system in the context of tropical forest countries, RED, so the framework for reduced emissions on deforestation and forest degradation, provides a framework to mobilize international funding to conserve the tropical forests. And that allows countries to access finance in the way how Susie described it so well. And then you have local forest managers, local communities that seek access to funding to protect or restore a public good or be rewarded, honestly, in many cases, in the case particular with indigenous communities, to get proper reward for the centuries of stewardships that they have exercised over tropical forest resources. Now, if we look at international sources of finance for countries, you have, I'm looking here exclusively at results-based finance, and we have results-based finance linked to carbon markets, and results-based finance not linked to carbon markets means that in some cases there is an issuance of a tradable unit and in others not. And of course, if you do not have an issuance of a transferable unit, then the criteria are not quite as strict. However, results-based finance still makes any kind of payment conditional upon the verification of certain environmental greenhouse gas outcomes. It is a results-based finance is per definition ex post, and we have national and subnational systems which currently support results-based finance in, for example, the REM, so the Red Early Movers program of Germany, but also the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund makes ex post payments, but doesn't link them to carbon market. And then we have transfer-based finance with partly linked to private carbon markets or linked to international carbon markets. So eventually also to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we have here the voluntary carbon market, and then we have systems like the FCPF, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank. In both cases, you have more strict requirements in terms of certifying the emission reduction, and you have a transfer of title, and in the case of markets, also the issuance of a unit. Now, what does that mean? And that's my last slide. So the situation in many countries, in particular in developing countries, and we can take here the example of Colombia to stay with us, where also Susanna, our next speaker, is located. You have often results-based finance for national or subnational jurisdictional greenhouse gas emission reductions, where local governments or the national governments apply to get results-based finance. This is then backed by a benefit sharing plan, which then involves communities, creates incentives on the ground to conserve forest. The reality is in many countries, you have also existing or new voluntary carbon market projects, and they supply, in the case of Colombia, the domestic carbon market, but they can also supply voluntary carbon market demand. And then you have, in the future, you may have Article 6 transactions under the Paris Agreement. The challenge here, in particular for developing countries, is to harmonize the accounting, the MRV, which we all agreed is a particular challenge, to harmonize the MRV across the territory and to avoid confusion across units, across different standards. And so even if a government welcomes all these sources of finance, the government is called upon to ideally to create common definitions, to create ideally reference levels that then also the projects can use, and ensure that it all becomes a whole and is not just the box of many disconnected activities. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Charlotte, thank you very much. And I'm happy and thrilled to see that questions keep pouring in. So they will be addressed shortly, but first we also want to give Susanna the opportunity to add her comments in brief presentation. Susanna, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Charlotte and Susie, for the presentations and for opening the floor of what I'm going to present right now. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. And please let me know if you can see my screen, right?
We can, Susan.
Okay,
we can.
Perfect. So Susie talked first of all about ETS systems and how to include the forestry and land use and agriculture sector. Charlotte talked about combining and this type of programs with voluntary markets, and I want to give you a little bit more of detail on how forestry and the land use sector has been responding to these carbon pricing instruments. First of all, this is a figure where we can see how voluntary carbon markets have been evolving over time, and where we can see a steady growth of the demand and the production of emission reductions from different standards for different types of markets, because now what we are seeing is that voluntary markets are being combined basically with compliance markets. And the case of Colombia is one of those cases, but this will be more common in the future, because we see other countries in the Latin American region as Chile, Peru, even Mexico, thinking about accepting voluntary carbon credits from the voluntary market with very specific requirements into those compliance markets, such as Colombia is doing, and they are trying to see how this could benefit this specific sector, the AFOLU sector, that is one of the most complicated in our countries. Susie mentioned a lot of things here: land tenure, MRV systems, communication, benefit sharing with communities or with owners. This is a challenge for us and for us as a region, and it's very complicated when we talk about only ETS systems, because putting some specific taxes into these sectors may have social considerations that we will have to think, and very technical details for transaction costs that can make these specific ETS systems for the region very, very expensive or not effective at all. Then going back to the voluntary markets, as you can see here, we have prices and project types where we can see that the forestry and land use sector has been growing. Has been growing and has better prices, meaning that even if the transaction costs of developing programs and projects, because here we're talking about both activities, it's very good. I mean, very good when you translate this into Colombian pesos, for example. When you talk about US dollars, it won't be maybe that amazing. But thinking that we have a lot of communities that are living under poverty lines, meaning that they don't even earn $1 US per day. When you see this type of prices and the money that is getting into the communities to protect forest, to restore forest, or to establish plantations, because we, for example, in Colombia, we've seen the growth of projects for plantation, carbon projects for plantations under different standards. It shows that establishing a carbon tax, for example, with a compensation mechanism such as Colombia has, will increase the development of carbon projects, specifically in the AFOLU sector. This has been shown, and here I want to show you, this is data specifically for the VCS program. Sorry, I don't have all the specific data for other standards, but we are seeing that every day we are getting more requests for the registration of projects, carbon projects, for the AFOLU sector. And this is very interesting because the demand, as Charlotte and Susie mentioned, is not only because of carbon taxes, it's also because of voluntary commitments of many companies that are thinking about compensating the emissions they cannot reduce at the moment, but also because they are expecting new carbon prices and new carbon pricing mechanisms in the region where they have activities or where they have economic development. So they are seeking for early carbon units, for so to say, for projects, even in setting projects, meaning that they will develop their own projects. This is a project that I want to develop, I want to invest here, and I want to get the carbon credits for my company. That is very interesting. Of course, it has challenges. It can have some specific comments from saying, okay, this may be greenwashing, but what we are seeing here is that companies, the public, the private sector is very interested in investing in the follow sector that has not only carbon credits as a benefit, but also has co-benefits. And this is very important because we see as a standard more and more requests to measure SDGs and to measure co-benefits, specifically with biodiversity and with community protection. So this is very interesting. And I think that when we think about carbon pricing, we're not thinking only about reducing emissions, but these other co-benefits in the climate change, I don't know, quest that we are facing here to start implementing projects and programs that will have all of the benefits that we're expecting: adaptation, mitigation, protection of communities, protection of biodiversity, and all the other SDGs that we could reach here. It's very interesting also to understand that this has an MRV challenge and that we need to invest even more there. The carbon prices that we are seeing now in the carbon pricing system are not enough. We understand that they should be higher, but the challenge of the economy and the investment is still there. And finally, this is a very interesting figure where we see that the follow sector has been getting more and more demand year after year. The natural climate solutions, the follow sector, the preservation of forests has been like the star of this new demand that is also driven, as I mentioned before, from carbon markets, from voluntary carbon markets, from voluntary commitments, but also for carbon pricings from different mechanisms, such as ETS, potential ETS, the CORSIA, the future CORSIA market, Article 6. We will see how this works, but basically it's been driven for because of the future commitments that we see carbon markets and will be demanding in each country, and specifically in the Latin American region. This is just some things I have here for you. There's my contact if you have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susanne. Thanks to all of you for really setting the stage very, very well. I think, this is part and parcel of your work, and you're deep in the methodological issues, the technical challenges, the policy developments. And what I think you sort of conveyed is a sense that this is doable and it can be done in a credible way with integrity. But as you know, there's some jurisdictions who have expressed great, let's say, hesitation, in some cases outright skepticism, to integrate these kinds of activities, these sectors, into carbon pricing systems. And there's also a perception in certain segments, if you look in media reporting, etc., environmental justice, that this is greenwashing, or this will happen to the detriment of local, indigenous, and other communities, etc. Can you give us a bit of a sense? This question is to all of you, how you see sort of this hesitation, which jurisdictions in particular have been cautious, for what reasons, and whether you think that that is indeed something that, as the methods improve, as the proof of concept, let's say, becomes more and more evident, might be overcome. Any of you want to take that question?
I can also.
Charlotte,
by all means. It is, of course, so there are good projects and there are bad projects, and there are credible jurisdictional programs and not so credible jurisdictional programs. There are good actors and bad actors. It depends, probably in terms of the of the environmental credibility, the largest risk are inflated baselines. So this is, I think, the risk is really that, with unrealistic baselines at whatever level, we create hot air in the system. So being there conservative is absolutely essential. When it comes to the communities and local benefits, a number of points. First of all, local communities not always, and many countries don't have so excellent experience with the government. So there is a lot of mistrust already in the system. So it is not by just saying the government should solve it that necessarily this is the best solution. So it can be, in some systems, it can be that where, there's a good payment for ecosystem services program and there is trust in the communities. But in many cases, we see very fraught relationships. In these cases, communities are empowered if they can monetize their carbon rights vis-a-vis the government or vis-a-vis the outside world. But it is something that they are not easily to give up. So we need, I don't think we need necessarily to look at this always as something, that is taking advantage of communities. In many cases, this is something that empowers communities to give them right over their natural resource, because there is such a terrible history in recognizing these rights in many, many cases. Then I think there is a big push now in the community to be much more explicit about sustainable development benefits. We see this as something, there's a lot of rumbling and different initiatives at the level of the gold standard, at the level of different jurisdictional programs with safeguard information systems, at the level of the VCS, to look and be much more specific in certifying SDG components. So that means that where those that are worried about these impacts will get much more transparent information and can then also purchase credits accordingly. However, you don't get it cheap. I always get a bit annoyed, if there are all these buyer demands about having, worries about this and worries about this, but then they want the credit at $3 or $2.50. If you want good outcomes, you need to pay more and you need to pay the communities more. So I think that's, it doesn't come just by being skeptical. It means you just need to put money where your values are.
Mm-hmm. Great reply. Any other reactions, Susie or Susanna? We have plenty of questions, so I'm also eager to move to the long list of questions, but please, if you still, Susie, wanted to react.
Just a quick comment. I think people struggle with this a lot because it feels really complex and abstract, and they can't see the emission. They're not used to dealing with these sorts of approaches. And so I think that's led to some of the skepticism. And as we get the examples operating, then people will feel more comfortable with some of those issues, because a lot of the things people are worried about actually are problems in all other systems and with all other sources as well. And I just want to say, for Māori in New Zealand, they have been one of the major beneficiaries of the system, and they have managed to make it work with some of the issues that Charlotte is saying, but certainly there are examples where it's worked well, and we just need to make sure that happens generally.
Great, thank you. Let's start tackling and see how many of these questions we can work our way through. We have about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit of flexibility depending how many attendees are there, 5 minutes extra, but let's try to remain on time. First, a question that was in the chat, in fact, there's two that are very closely related, and I'll pose them. I think it's primarily to Susie and Susanna, but I think all of you can weigh in. So John Erneberg was remarking that the scheme that Susie was outlining of rental payments with text messages and automatic bank payments, for instance, how would that work in a developing country? He may be in Brazil, because he was saying, would that work in Brazil? I'm not so sure. I think it can probably be overcome. I'd be curious on your thoughts. But Camilo Trujillo was writing that there'd been criticism in on the lax MRV in Colombia, including AFOLO activities. And so that's more a question, I think, of capacity and technical implementation. So also to Susanna, perhaps, can you elaborate a bit more on what it takes precisely to overcome those perceptions that it's not sufficiently credible? And this goes, I think, to what Charlotte was already starting to say.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Well, the MRV problem, I think it's a general problem all around the world, because you will always have lacks of capacities, or the images won't be not good enough, and we will have always room to improve. As you can see in Latin America and Central America, well, in Latin America in general, it's that MRV systems are improving, that we can see every year, we can see better and better reports on deforestation, early deforestation reports, and you see the hotspots of deforestation. Of course, it will be always a challenge. I mean, we have such huge regions covered by clouds, or where you have deforestation linked to illegal activities that will not be only stopped by saying, oh, we have deforestation there, but we will have to solve a lot of social economic problems there. But the thing is that we have been improving, and as Charlotte mentioned, we have to improve in the baselines, in the accuracy, and in the being very cautious about how we produce or how we measure the amount of emissions that are being reduced or produced, in both cases, to have the confidence that what we are saying is truth. So we, for example, as Standard, we are trying to improve every day to see how accurate we can be, how strict we can be, without making impossible to measure what we want to measure, even if it's SDGs or carbon credits or co-benefits, because the idea here is to be flexible and able to include as many stakeholders as possible. Text messaging in the Amazon and bank accounting may be difficult, but also technology and new forms of payments are getting there. And we see experiences in Peru, in Colombia, in the Amazon region, in Brazil even, where they are starting to get those payments and starting to get the benefits, monetary and non-monetary, because you have both. But yeah, of course, it's a challenge, and we don't know how to solve this at once, but I think working together is the solution to all of these questions that we still have.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let me move to a question by Ingrid Schulte, directed at Susie. And it goes back again to the rental payments proposal. She was wondering how different types of forests and ages could be accounted for, if at all. I think you mentioned ages already, but especially also types of forest. Is that something in the proposal?
So the ages is relatively simple, because you're starting from zero. So if the program is entered in, you know that there wasn't any forest at a particular time, you've got satellite imagery repeatedly, you can at least estimate the age of the forest. It is hard to see when they're very young, but after a while you'll be able to. In terms of types of forests, and the way New Zealand has worked for small forest areas is that you use lookup tables. So you're not actually trying to measure the forest, but you put in the species, they know the region that you're in, and they estimate based on external data how much carbon is likely to be in that forest. That can be quite challenging for native regeneration, which tends to vary a lot by space, and the numbers are less accurate there. So it's better than nothing. And as Susanna has said, these sorts of things are improving all the time, and we can get more accurate with that.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. Another question in the Q&A from Maria Spink. She was interested on your views whether improved calculation of methane by global warming potential and sort of considering the short-lived nature of methane is part already of methodologies. Any takers?
This is a huge issue. So I would first say that this is not about calculation. There's not a correct answer to how much you should value methane relative to CO2. It's a judgment about how much the reductions matter now relative to how much they will matter in future. And that depends partly on how much value outcomes to people now in the future, what we think living standards will be like in the future, what sort of world they're going to live in, what we think about future potential for rapid reductions. Do we think that in the future we'll be able to do direct air capture and storage? Do we think that we will be able to make a much more rapid transition than we're anticipating? How fast do we think we're going to be able to adapt? Our short-term damage is particularly painful because we're not prepared for them. These are all things that we like to be able to get really good evidence on and people are working on, but ultimately involves a lot of judgment. So I think that's my critical message, is that there isn't a correct answer to this, and we need to have an honest discussion about what it is that we are thinking about. What are we assuming when we push for more concern about short-lived or more concern about long-lived gases?
Great, thank you. A question from Gustavo Andrade Reginato. He's talking about, or he's asking about the fungibility of credits from AFOLO activities from the FOLO sector, specifically asking about whether that's been an issue in the New Zealand ETS, but also more generally. Are all these credits in a way equal in terms of the mitigation value they represent? Or does one have to think about distinguishing, as I think the voluntary carbon market is doing through the market in some ways? Any thoughts on that?
I can respond quickly for the New Zealand system. So in New Zealand, it's all one unit. So they're New Zealand units, the government issues them. It's the only unit that is traded. So they're treated absolutely identically. There has been interest in being able to identify if a unit comes from native forest regeneration because of the co-benefits that some buyers are willing to pay extra for, but they are treated as entirely fungible, as they are treated in our national inventory.
Charlotte, I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that, of course, how these systems are designed reflect policy objectives of the governments. This is including the funds, and this is what Susie also said. This is also where you say, okay, you should not be overly concerned about being too obsessed with measurement, because you have a public policy goal that you want to achieve. And in New Zealand, it was always, including the whole land sector. In the EU ETS for the longest time was explicitly to reduce industrial emissions in the EU. So then you have a different set of objectives, and then you don't want the fungibility. Now, if the EU is now considering, including forest into the system, it is exactly this type of question that it needs to ask. Do we want now the fungibility of the credits, or should it be a particular system to channel particular, finance into, but outside, ring fence a system and have it at offset, maybe, with qualitative or quantitative limitation. But that's a public policy decision. Another point is when you look at it as an offset. As an offset, you need to, of course, make sure if you offset an industrial emission with a land emission, you need to make sure that it is equally robust in measurement. And that means, being very conservative. It means to have permanence buffers. It means to have, leakage belt. It means all the systems that you need to put in place, and that the standards by now have put in place, to have, confidence that this is equivalent. But there's always, this is a system made by people for people to achieve people's goals. So it is always, part of it is a decision of governments what they want to achieve.
Fabulous. We're getting more questions, or we're getting them faster than we can answer them. I'll bundle two here. The first one was about to Susie about whether regenerative agriculture is included in some way in the New Zealand ETS. I think you already briefly hinted at that. But another question from Danai Azuara in the Mexican Climate Initiative about whether livestock methane, of any examples of taxes on livestock methane at national or subnational level. And again, to any other panelists, of course, if you have.
Right. So the question about regenerative agriculture, it would be potentially included. New Zealand is currently in the process of designing a farm scale emissions levy that would model the emissions from a farm system. A system that was regenerative would have different emissions in the way that other practices and ways of farming would have different emissions. So if the effects of regenerative farming are picked up in those methodologies, yes, it would be rewarded. If it's leading to changes in soil carbon, the New Zealand system will not currently pick that up. That's partly to do with New Zealand's unusual conditions in terms of soil, very high levels of heterogeneity and very high levels of existing carbon storage in soils. So there's not a lot of opportunity. That would be very different in other places where the carbon opportunity is large. But my science colleagues at EDF tell me there's really still a lot of uncertainty around the science of the carbon sequestration in soils. We're not really sure exactly what would be appropriate to credit in that space. In terms of livestock methane, I am not aware of anyone who has actually implemented a price on livestock emissions agriculture. It's possible there's one that I don't know of, but I think New Zealand is the one who has come closest. So ask me that question again in a few years and I hope I'll be able to say yes.
Perfect, thank you. I wanted to make sure there's a question on voluntary carbon markets, but Charlotte already typed an answer. Still, I think it was an interesting one, and it links nicely to another one by Rogier van Menen earlier up. This one is by Stephanie Laroche-Toyer. First of all, Rogier was curious. One of the sources of demand for voluntary carbons is, of course, expected to be CORSIA, the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. And Rogier was wondering if you have any sort of expectations, very speculative, about what prices one might expect there. But Stephanie's point was to the fact that demand is still, well, supply in the voluntary market is still outstripping demand, although I think that's a dynamic that is changing. And whether or not, you know, the voluntary carbon market can be as effective a way of sending a price signal to the sector, and what sort of the dynamics could be at different levels, international, national, subnational, to ensure such a price signal in AFOLO. So a bit of a bundle of questions, but related to the voluntary market. Susanna and especially Charlotte.
Well, I can give it a start, and then Susanna and Susie can add. First of all, there is an enormous amount of confusion, because there are all these numbers of these companies, and if they were to offset everything and then it all explodes, and then we have marginal abatement cost curves that say, this can happen, and then you have enormous supply. I think we need to cool that down. I think there is, the realistic supply is, and still needs to be assessed. And then we need to match it with financing sources. So my sense is, we will have the more developed countries will hopefully relatively fast adopt, jurisdictional programs, with their projects nested in it or without, but having jurisdictional programs. But this is only, the really a bit more advanced countries, because you need to have registries, you need to have safeguard systems, so you need to have a lot in place to qualify. At the same time, we will have some countries where it takes much longer, and we have some countries that may essentially never reach that stage. In these countries, we'll still see agricultural and forest projects. But again, to make them work on the ground, this is a lot of work to do it credibly. So and if we take the hot air of inflated baselines out of the system, the supply is not that big. It is not that you can go and just buy endless amount of red credits from jurisdictional projects. They are not there. So we need to invest, again, we need to invest into this. We need to support the countries to meet the requirements. We need to support the communities. We cannot just say, this is happening, this is cheap, this will, will flood the market. It will not happen.
Yes, agreed, Charlotte. The thing with jurisdiction and projects and programs and the combination of those, it's key to understand how much we can produce. We can really produce of carbon credits, of emission reductions. Also, the thing about being permanent and an additional to make them real. It's something we're struggling here, but the key is to recognize that there are some projects that have been making efforts to not let them out of the picture, because that won't be fair to those already committing to this process. But also what Charlotte mentioned is that we cannot have an infinite supply of carbon credits. I mean, with the case of Colombia, we have a demand of 52 million tons per year. And when we reach the maximum amount of carbon credits that we could produce with, I think, 4 or 5 standards, we got 14 million tons in 1 year. And that was with retroactivity of almost 5 to 6 years. So just imagine that in 1 year, a huge REDD+ project can produce, I don't know, 2 million tons. I mean, huge, more than 300,000 hectares. So when we talk about demand and offer, it's very complicated to reach that. And we are sure that we will never reach that amount of carbon credits from any type of projects. So the idea here is that you have to have both reduction, that it's very complicated and it's very specific for aviation, but also compensation to see how we can combine mechanisms and we can combine solutions, because this is not one tool that will solve everything. So this is something that we have to take into account.
Fantastic. We're nearing the end of our 90 minutes, but we still have 100 attendees. If you could bear with me for one more question, 2 questions, in fact. We won't be able, of course, to answer all, and I'm therefore very grateful that some participants have already begun answering each other's questions in the chat, and some of you in the panel as well. These 2 questions I felt were sort of struck a chord. The first one was, as you might have noticed, an anonymous youth from Indonesia. And it's a nice question, who's really, you know, he caught the bug, I think. He's enthusiastic about the topic and would like to know how to go about trying to launch an initiative for voluntary carbon market activities from agroforestry and engage youth. Of course, it's a very broad question, maybe a little bit more specific also, but related. Mikola Schlapak was asking, what is the national policy environment that jurisdictions are that are interested in leveraging the potential from AFOLO would have to put in place in order to get activities, especially voluntary activities, started in agriculture? But I think one could also expand that to both. So for those jurisdictions and countries out there that are thinking about this, what would be sort of the first steps that they have to take? And to some extent, I think that addresses the question of our anonymous youth from Indonesia as well. Any thoughts?
Well, this is a technical thing, because we want it to be real. What you're measuring has to be real. So you have to follow the rules of the standard or of the measurement that the country is doing, or of the program that the country is implementing. It needs a little bit of technical knowledge, but you can get that. I mean, none of us were experts in these fields before joining, and we keep on learning every day. So I encourage you to take a look at the information that is there. And when you talk about jurisdictions and how jurisdictions can think about this type of projects, is to understand what you already have on the field, who's there, who are the players already into the field, before establishing the rules of a jurisdictional program that may affect those players, and also to establish how these players will be into the program, and how the accountability of program and projects will be done to have a real emission reduction.
Charlotte has to leave sharp on the half hour, so thank you very much. I will wrap up. I think the presenters have generously allowed us to upload the presentations. Their contact details are there. Is it okay if people still have the technical questions and want to follow up if they reach out to you? So that's an opportunity to still get to some of the very specific questions in the Q&A. I also want to draw your attention to the chat where you have a link to the mini site where we have the presentations from past webinar installments and where the ones from this webinar will be uploaded. You'll also find information on upcoming webinar sessions there, and it'll also be uploaded to the ICAP, the International Carbon Action Partnership's own website. But with that, I want to thank, Charlotte has already left us, but Susie and Susanna for wonderful presentations, for making very approachable, a very complex and difficult topic, but one in which there's enormous dynamic. And I think that explains the interest we've had from the audience in this enormous, it's a very good turnout, better than our previous webinars. And with that, I'll also thank the European Commission for helping support this, the International Carbon Action Partnership, of course, for hosting, and hope to see many of the participants again on March 10th when we have the next webinar session, which will deal with how to use revenue from carbon pricing and emissions trading. Please follow this space. We look forward to seeing you in future installments. Stay safe, everybody. And thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the
Bye,
invitation.
Susanna.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.